I'm going to return here to the subject of deception, false evidence placed on the record, by providing you with my two basic conclusions about the JFK medical evidence. I'm going to start with my basic conclusions and then lead you through the reasoning that led me to those conclusions. Other autopsy photographs, other than the back of the head photos, appear to depict the results of clandestine post-mortem surgery conducted prior to the autopsy, and were used by the two Navy pathologists to intentionally misrepresent the results of this illicit surgery as damage caused by the assassin's bullet. As we proceed, you'll see what I mean by this. We're going to be examining several disturbing images, autopsy photographs from President Kennedy's autopsy. These are officially considered bootleg images, but I have seen the original materials 16 times in the course of my duties. And I can assure you that all of these images, although the sources are bootleg sources, all of these images do accurately represent the autopsy images in the National Archives. The images are disturbing, but they must be examined for us to understand the nature of the cover-up. My second major conclusion regarding the medical evidence is that the brain photos in the autopsy collection cannot be images of JFK's brain. Instead, they are images taken at a second fraudulent brain examination of someone else's brain. Now, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as Carl Sagan once said, and I'm about to provide you with the evidence behind these conclusions. Mortician Tom Robinson told the ARRB staff in 1996 that the damage seen in this autopsy photo of JFK was, quote, what the doctors did, unquote, and was not damage caused by the bullet. We interviewed Tom Robinson in June of 1996 in the Review Board's office. The General Counsel, Jeremy Gunn, conducted the questioning. I was the note taker. Many other people were present, including Executive Director David Marwell and I would say 4 or 5 other staff members. We showed Tom Robinson this image of the top of President Kennedy's head taken at the autopsy, and he became visibly agitated and disturbed. I would say Tom Robinson was more agitated when viewing this image than when viewing any other image that day. He's a country boy, and his exact words are still clear in my mind. He said, well, that makes it look like that's what the bullet did, but he said, that's what the doctors did. That's exactly how he phrased it. At that moment, Jeremy Gunn and I looked at each other, and I can only say it was an epiphany. We knew that the hypothesis about clandestine surgery before the autopsy that had been proposed by David Lifton in his book, Best Evidence, in 1981 was true. The only question was, where did this surgery take place? Tom Robinson vividly recalled the doctors doing this damage. He didn't recall the president arriving looking like this. You'll recall that we just looked at the diagram Tom Robinson made for the review board staff. He recalled a circular hole the size of a small orange in the back of President Kennedy's head. That's the wound he saw when the body arrived. This large wound in this photograph is damage Tom Robinson saw performed by the doctors at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Now, in the way of explanation, Robinson told the ARRB staff that the dotted lines in his wound diagram represented the saw cuts the pathologist made to remove the brain. Let me explain what I mean here. At a normal autopsy, if the person was killed by a gunshot wound to the brain or physical trauma to the brain by a blow to the head, the scalp would first be reflected back. The top of the skull cap, would be sawn off, removed by sawing, literally lifted off the person's head. The pathologist would then have access to the person's brain and could slowly but carefully remove the brain in order to examine it later after it was preserved in formaldehyde. Dr. Humes, the chief pathologist, Dr. James J. Humes, always claimed, especially under oath to the Warren Commission, that he never had to perform a craniotomy. His baseline position from the time he testified before our inspector until the time he testified before the review board was that the head wound was so large that he never had to perform a craniotomy. All he had to do is snip some scalp away here and there, and he could reach in and remove the brain. Well, that sounded ludicrous at best to everyone who ever read those comments. But Tom Robinson, by drawing his recollection of the wound as he originally saw it that night, a wound very consistent with the Dallas observations, and by then telling us that all the damage to the top of the head was caused by the autopsy doctors, Tom Robinson has put the lie to Dr. Humes' claim that he never had to perform a craniotomy. So what Dr. Humes, I have concluded, really did was perform a modified craniotomy before the autopsy began. There's a lot of evidence for this. We'll be going through it. But the skull was opened up so that evidence could be removed from the body. All evidence of frontal shots, I'm convinced, was removed from the body before the autopsy began. I'm talking about entrance wounds in the front of the skull. I'm talking about bullet tracks in the brain that would have been consistent with a frontal shot, and I'm talking about bullet fragments removed from the brain. This was the purpose for the surgery that Dr. Humes performed before the autopsy began, and this is what Tom Robinson was witnessing, although I'm sure he didn't understand it at the time, the significance of it. He was witnessing a modified craniotomy, and he has told us, he and one other key witness, where this surgery took place. It didn't take place before the body arrived at Bethesda. It took place after the body arrived at Bethesda. Dr. Humes, assisted by Dr. Boswell, performed this illicit clandestine cranial surgery. Now, there's a second witness to this surgery being performed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that witness is X-ray technician Ed Reed. There were two Navy X-ray technicians. One was Gerald Custer, he was the petty officer in charge, and his colleague was Ed Reed. Ed Reed told the review board staff under oath in 1997 that he saw Dr. Humes perform both an incision of the scalp and saw cuts to the frontal bone, consistent with the damage directly above JFK's forehead in this autopsy photograph. So let me repeat what I mean here. Just behind JFK's hairline at the top of his forehead, Ed Reed witnessed Dr. Humes make a long sideways incision with a scalpel, follow up with a circular bone saw, and begin to cut open the bone beneath that scalp. These are the motions that Ed Reed demonstrated under oath during his review board deposition. He said Dr. Humes made a scalpel cut like this on President Kennedy's skull, and then pulled out a circular bone saw and began cutting the bone directly underneath the incision. At that point, Ed Reed said he and his supervisor, Gerald Custer, were summarily dismissed from the morgue. Get out of here. Go upstairs to the X-ray department. We'll call you when we need you. According to Ed Reed, they were recalled about 15 minutes later. About 15 minutes later, they went back downstairs, and as Gerald Custer, his colleague, has stated under oath, all of the X-rays of the skull were taken in one session at one time. They were all taken one after the other, and then taken back upstairs, and it took about 30 minutes to develop all of those X-rays, and then they were brought back to the morgue where they were read by Dr. Ebersol. Now, to reiterate, Dr. Humes always insisted that he had never had to perform a craniotomy, a skull cap removal, to remove the president's brain. He maintained this lie under oath for 33 years before the Warren Commission, the HSCA, and the Review Board. Significantly, Humes also informed Army pathologist Pierre Fink who arrived late at Bethesda to assist with the autopsy, that, quote, no sawing of the skull was necessary, end quote, in order to remove President Kennedy's brain. Now, Dr. Fink was a meticulous note-taker and kept diaries. He took the notes that he made at the time and created an official report for his commanding officer in 1965. His commanding officer was General Bloomberg at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. His report of activities that he witnessed at the autopsy and activities he participated in was typewritten, double-spaced, submitted to General Bloomberg in 1965. And this is how we have this statement recorded, that no sawing of the skull was necessary to remove the brain. Well, that's ludicrous on the surface of it, number one. No one at Dallas saw a wound large enough to remove a brain through, and no one at Dallas saw a large wound at the right side of the head or in the top of the head. So when Dr. Fink recorded in the Bloomberg report that Humes told him that no sawing of the skull was necessary, it indicates that Dr. Fink was also a victim of deception. Because what happened was that when the skull x-rays were developed and examined, all six, let's assume there were 6 skull x-rays. That's what Dr. Ebersol recalls, is 6 skull x-rays. When the 6 x-rays were developed and examined in the morgue, examined by Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, and Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist, Dr. Humes then called Dr. Fink on the phone at 8:00 p.m. that night. And Dr. Humes said, I've got a complete set of skull films. Please come on in and help us with the rest of the autopsy. So when Dr. Humes called Dr. Fink, he already had a completed set of films, which means that this surgery had already been completed. The x-rays had been taken. And this is why Dr. Fink did not arrive until 8:30 p.m. He arrived at 8:30. When Dr. Fink arrived, the brain had already been removed from the body. The lungs had been removed, and also the heart. Now, this is the condition that Fink found when he arrived. That's when Dr. Humes lied to Dr. Fink and said no sawing of the skull was necessary to remove the brain. We know that's not true because of the recollections of Tom Robinson before the review board and because of the sworn testimony of Ed Reed. Now, during the autopsy, Dr. Boswell, one of the 2 Navy pathologists, Dr. Boswell was assisting Dr. Humes. Dr. Boswell executed a freehand sketch on the back of the body chart. The body chart was called the autopsy descriptive sheet. This is an image of the freehand sketch Dr. Boswell made on the back of the body chart. You can see it at the National Archives today by special appointment if you want to. This is a diagram that Dr. Boswell made of the top of President Kennedy's skull, the top, not the side and not the rear. This is the top of the skull. You'll notice that in the center of the diagram are the numerical notations 10 by 17 and the word missing. So Dr. Boswell explained to the HSCA that this means that the bone was completely missing from the top of the skull in an area that was 10 by 17 centimeters in size. Let's discuss what this means for a minute. This is extremely important. This diagram made by Dr. Boswell showing the entire top of the skull missing is completely at variance with all of the observations of the Parkland Hospital treatment staff. It's at variance with the observations of Secret Service agent Clint Hill. It's at variance with the observations, the recollections of mortician Tom Robinson, who drew a localized wound in the back of the head only. And it's at variance with the recollections, you'll recall, of Dr. Berkeley and Dr. Canada, who both also told JFK researchers, specifically Mr. Kurtz, that they observed an exit wound in the rear of the head. So, neither Dr. Canada nor Dr. Berkeley described a massive head wound that blew the top of the head off. Nor did Tom Robinson, nor did the Dallas treatment staff, nor did Clint Hill. My conclusion, 50 years after the assassination, is that this diagram is a con job. It was executed knowingly and willfully by Dr. Boswell after the postmortem surgery in order to fool history. And he got away with it for about 33 years. But as the review board took its 10 depositions of autopsy witnesses and participants, and as we continued to interview other medical witnesses, it became clear to me And I think to Jeremy Gunn as well that this diagram is an intentional fraud. You'll notice that this diagram has on it the bloodstains purportedly from President Kennedy. President Kennedy's bloodstains are on this piece of paper. And yet, Dr. Humes told the House Select Committee that the reason he burned all of the original autopsy notes was because they had blood on them, and he didn't want the president's blood to become an object of sordid fascination by collectors. So we have a Dr. Humes who told the Warren Commission under oath that he burned the first draft of the autopsy report. We have a Dr. Humes who then changed his story and told the House Select Committee that he burned the original notes written at the autopsy and that he burned the notes because they had blood on them. And yet, we have this crucial piece of paper here, which has a body chart on one side containing various organ weights, and on the other side it has this freehand sketch. It has blood all over it, and Dr. Humes didn't destroy this. Jeremy Gunn asked Dr. Humes under oath why he didn't destroy this set of notes, since he was so concerned about President Kennedy's blood not becoming an item for collectors to obsess over. Dr. Humes could provide no explanation. In fact, he gave a flippant response. So this supports my conclusion today that Dr. Boswell made this sketch intentionally to deceive history, representing the results of postmortem surgery as damage done by the assassin's bullet, when of course it's not. As Jeremy Gunn and I prepared to conduct the depositions of Drs. Humes and Boswell late in 1995, I suggested to my boss, Jeremy Gunn, that he allowed me to build a skull model of a human skull, and that we present Drs. Humes and Boswell with this model and ask them to draw a three-dimensional rendition of the wounds they recall at autopsy on the model, because all we had at that time was the two-dimensional sketch of the top of the skull made by Boswell. That's all we had that was made at the autopsy. Jeremy agreed. Dr. Humes, during his deposition, adamantly refused to make any markings on the skull model. However, we were able to talk Dr. Boswell into it. He reluctantly, but eventually, did make a diagram on the skull model of the full extent of the missing bone. That's what we wanted him to draw. What is the extent of the missing bone, which you depicted in your two-dimensional sketch, where you only show the top of the head? We wanted to know what the back of the head would look like. Dr. Boswell made his markings on the skull model, which you can see today in the National Archives by appointment if you wish. It's a deposition exhibit. You can see this exhibit if you request permission to see it. And I reduced his three-dimensional markings to 4 drawings. So what I did is I reproduced on 4 pieces of paper, to the best of my ability, what he drew on the skull model, for those of you who cannot travel to College Park, Maryland and see the actual skull yourselves. So in this first diagram that I made of Boswell's markings on the skull model, you'll see the massive amounts of bone completely missing from the cranium, according to Boswell, in the back of the skull. It wasn't just the top of the skull, it's also the back of the skull. Boswell, you'll note, drew a very small entry wound in the right rear of the skull, consistent with what they wrote in the autopsy report. The autopsy report states that there was a small wound of entrance about 2.5 centimeters to the right and slightly above the EOP. The EOP is the bump on the back of your head. And so in this sketch of what Boswell drew in the skull model, you can see that, yes, indeed, this small entry wound is drawn about 2.5 centimeters to the right of the external occipital protuberance, the bump on the back of the head. But directly above that, according to Boswell, was this enormous defect, which we now know was not only the top of the skull, it included the entire right rear of the skull. Let's look at the next view. This is the right lateral view of Boswell's skull model, drawn by me. This is the right-hand view, representing what he was attempting to convey in his freehand sketch of the top of the skull. This is the frontal view. It shows considerable frontal bone missing. Now, the frontal bone includes not only your forehead, but part of the top of your head, back to the coronal suture. The coronal suture joins a point just forward of your two ears. So the frontal bone includes your forehead and part of the dome on top of your head. So there is considerable frontal bone missing in this diagram. And then here is the top view of the skull that's in the archives. And you'll note the great similarity between this sketch that Boswell made on the skull model and his autopsy sketch that he made on the back of the body chart. 10 by 17 missing. So now you have a good concept of what the skull model in the archives depicts. Dr. Boswell essentially took his two-dimensional freehand sketch made at the autopsy and turned it into a three-dimensional rendition on a skull model. So these are my major conclusions about the medical cover-up. Dr. Hume surgically expanded the original exit wound in JFK's head to about 5 times its original size to gain access to the brain and remove forensic evidence of a frontal shot or shots before the autopsy officially began. This postmortem surgery allowed those controlling the cover-up to falsely claim that the massive damage to the top and right side of the skull, seen in the autopsy photos and x-rays, was caused by a shot from behind, consistent with the Texas School Book Depository. Remember, the Warren Commission's conclusion was that a lone assassin killed President Kennedy firing from above and behind. Their conclusion was that Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone malcontent, killed President Kennedy with a bolt-action rifle by firing 3 shots from above and behind, and that 1 shot had missed and that 2 shots had hit the president. The results of this illicit, clandestine surgery were sketched by Dr. Boswell, were x-rayed and photographed, and were intentionally misrepresented by both of the Navy pathologists to the official morgue audience and to numerous government bodies as, quote, damage caused by the assassin's bullet, unquote. Here is some supporting evidence for the postmortem surgery hypothesis. The bright red V-shaped trauma above the right eye is evidence of the surgical removal of an entry wound caused by a shot fired from the front. This is my conclusion. The reason for this is we have 2 witnesses who recall seeing photographs of an entrance wound high above the right eye, high in the forehead, in exactly this location. They saw these photographs the week after the assassination. Those photographs never made it into the official record. However, the location of this clear incision is exactly where they saw an entrance wound in postmortem photographs. Now, multiple lines of evidence indicate that this damage above JFK's right eye was the result of surgical tampering prior to the autopsy. In 1988, Dr. Paul Peters of Parkland Hospital described this damage in a documentary televised by PBS as, quote, an incision, unquote, thereby confirming that it was not present when JFK was treated at Parkland Hospital. There was no surgery whatsoever on JFK's cranium at Parkland Hospital. The only surgery performed on the president at Parkland was the tracheotomy in the throat to assist with breathing. There was no surgery on his skull, and so when Dr. Peters made the comment that this is an incision in a 1988 documentary, he's confirming not only that this is a man-made lesion, it's a man-made wound, but that he didn't see it in Dallas. Now, the 2 witnesses who saw photographs the week after the autopsy of an entrance wound in this exact location were Joe O'Donnell and Dennis David. Now, the 2 witnesses who saw photographs in the week following President Kennedy's autopsy of an entrance wound high in the forehead in exactly this same location were Joe O'Donnell and Dennis David. Joe O'Donnell was a USIA, U.S. Information Agency photographer detailed to the White House during the Kennedy years. Dennis David was a first-class corpsman in the Navy, an HM-1, an E-6. One of his close associates and friends was the person who ran the audiovisual lab at Bethesda Naval Hospital, Lieutenant Commander Pitzer. Within the week following the autopsy, Lieutenant Commander Pitzer showed Dennis David in Pitzer's office images of JFK which showed a small entrance wound high in the forehead, well above the right eye, in exactly this location. Joe O'Donnell was shown photographs of that same wound by Chief Robert Knudsen. Robert Knudsen was a Navy chief, a photographer's mate who worked at the White House. He showed Joe O'Donnell, his White House colleague, photographs of the same small entrance wound within a week of the president's death. Those photographs are not in the record today. They never made it into the official record for obvious reasons. But these witnesses are highly credible people. Tom Robinson first described seeing a small hole in JFK's cranium at this approximate site to the HSCA staff in 1977. And in fact, there's a transcript of this interview. Robinson decided to tape the interview, and because he audiotaped, the HSCA audiotaped. Because the HSCA audiotaped, they made a transcript of the interview. When all of the House Committee medical records, when the staff records were released in 1993 because of the JFK Records Act, the HSCA transcript of the Robinson interview was released. And in that transcript, it is revealed that his questioner, Andrew Purdy, at one point asked Mr. Robinson to verify, so this wound is way above the right eye, correct? And Robinson said yes. So it's from that transcript of the HSCA interview of Robinson that we know that he saw the same wound. There's one other indicator that this red V-shaped damage in this autopsy photograph is a man-made incision. During his ARRB deposition, Dr. Boswell described a long laceration present on President Kennedy's skull during his deposition, and he said that the long laceration or tear came down above the right eye. On one occasion, however, I think Dr. Boswell was guilty of a Freudian slip. On one occasion, he described this damage above the right eye in the autopsy photographs as an incised wound. That's a significant statement. An incised wound is a man-made wound, an incision made by a human being. So Dr. Boswell's laceration, what he would have had us believe was a laceration, was even revealed by him on one occasion when he slipped up as an incision. And that's in the deposition transcript. It's in the JFK Records collection, and you can read it yourself. There's additional corroborating evidence of an entrance wound high above the right eye, and that's provided by a new evidence who has come forward since my book was published. I was contacted in the year 2010 by a person named Quentin Schwinn. He's a contractor with a high-level security clearance who works at one of the 8 NASA centers. He was once a student of photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. He has a vivid recollection of being approached during what was clearly a job interview in late 1982 or early 1983 while he was a student at RIT. He was approached by one of his professors, a Professor David Hazy, and by an unknown stranger from out of town. The stranger had a briefcase. The stranger pulled out 2 photographs. One was a satellite image of airplanes parked on a runway, obviously taken from a great distance. And they asked Mr. Schwinn all kinds of photogrammetric questions about how would you determine the size of this airplane, the length of the wings, the length of these shadows. And apparently he satisfied them with his answers. He indicated to them that he had a good knowledge of photogrammetry and of photography and photographic analysis. They then showed him one color positive transparency, a postmortem image of JFK after death. And I spent 3 years off and on interviewing Mr. Schwinn on the phone, assessing his credibility. I even had him contact RIT, and I had them send me a sealed transcript of his matriculation there. I received the sealed transcript. I verified that he was in school there when he said he was. He did receive the 2 degrees in photography that he said he did. And my considered judgment after interviewing him for 3 years is that Quentin Schwinn is a reliable witness and that he was shown a postmortem image of President Kennedy, which is not in the official collection today, by 2 individuals as part of a recruitment pitch. By the way, he was subsequently offered 2 federal jobs in photography and declined both of them. But this event happened. And so this is what I encouraged him to do. This image is the result of Quentin Schwinn going to a qualified medical illustrator, describing for him what he recalls seeing in the image, and getting the medical illustrator to draw a picture. And I believe this is the third or fourth attempt of the effort. I mean, Quentin Schwinn is a perfectionist, and he had, in fact, more than one artist work on the project, and he finally settled on the best artist. And then I think this is the third attempt made by the second artist. This is important for two reasons. One is the entrance wound, apparent entrance wound above the right eye, and the other reason is the condition of the throat wound, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. So this is the wound that apparently Dennis David and Joe O'Donnell recall seeing in photographs the week after the autopsy. I forwarded this image to Dennis David with a minimum of description and asked him if it was similar in any way to the photographs he was shown by Lieutenant Commander Pitzer. And he said the entrance wound above the right eye is exactly what he recalls. The condition of the throat wound is different, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, which is significant. But he said that the small entrance wound above the right eye is 100% consistent with the photographs shown to him by Lieutenant Commander Pitzer a week after JFK's death. Joe O'Donnell is now deceased, so I could not contact him. But this, I think, gives the viewer a good impression of an entry wound from a shot from the front, which was later removed from President Kennedy's skull by illicit, clandestine, post-mortem surgery before the autopsy began. My considered conclusion after many years of thought is that that bullet, which entered well above the right eye, that shot from the front, is not the cause of the blowout in the right rear of the head seen at Parkland Hospital. I believe this bullet, which entered in this location, exited high in the left rear of the skull, and it did not make a particularly large exit wound. I believe it made the exit wound seen in this image. This image was described as the posterior skull by the autopsy pathologist. In 1966, when the Kennedy family returned the autopsy photographs to the government, when they gave the photographs to the National Archives, the doctors were called in the next day. Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, and Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist, and Mr. Stringer, the photographer. They were told to make a catalog and just describe by title what is being seen in each image. The title they gave this photograph was The Posterior Skull, the Back of the Head. Dr. Mantic, an associate of mine, has been to the archives 9 times. He's viewed the archives autopsy materials 9 times, both the photographs and the x-rays, with the permission of the Kennedy family. He has examined this image stereoscopically with a stereoscopic viewer that he made himself. He put 2 transparencies in there that were almost identical and was able to see a 3D view of this image. This image is cropped somewhat at the top. The actual transparency in the archive shows more in its field of view than this image does. Dr. Mantic was able to observe that this has to be the rear of the head because at the top of the image he could see President Kennedy's chest. The president's lying on his back on the examining table. This is the top and right side and rear of the head gone in this image, and he could see the nipples on President Kennedy's chest in the 3D stereoscopic viewer and the abdominal fat pads which had been folded back. So through his personal viewing of the photographs, Dr. Mantic has confirmed that this is indeed the rear of the head and that the large cavity in the cranium is in the top and right rear of the head. Now, examining the image again, you'll notice that in the center of the image there's a semicircular notch. It's a little bit out of focus, but there's a semicircular notch in the bone and the scalp has been reflected back. The House Select Committee on Assassination's Forensic Pathology Panel identified that notch as forensic evidence of a bullet's exit. Forensic evidence of exit. In other words, it's cratering, and the cratering The larger part of the hole is on the outside of the skull. I conclude that this semicircular beveled notch is the exit wound for the bullet that entered right here. I don't believe this exit wound was seen at Parkland Hospital because I don't believe that the scalp underneath it was blown away from the body. I think that they were all focused on the one large head wound they could see, which was the massive void back in this area about the size of a baseball or an orange, which was devoid of scalp and skull. That's the one wound that they all fixated on and observed. So I believe that this exit wound went unobserved at Parkland Hospital. I believe this entrance wound went unobserved at Parkland Hospital because I think it was covered up by the president's bangs. The president had long hair in front, much longer than mine. It was very thick, and I think that's why they didn't see this entrance wound right in the hairline, because it was obscured by the president's bangs. I think it's a reasonable conclusion to make. Now, there's one aspect about this photograph that's very troubling, and most people don't really understand it, and I'm going to explain this controversy to you so that you understand the sleight of hand that's going on here with the U.S. government. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, their forensic pathology panel, decided to reorient this photograph, and they never told anyone when they wrote their report what they had done. They never told you that the autopsy doctors and the autopsy radiologist and the autopsy photographer had called this the posterior skull, the back of the head. They described this photograph as the right front of the head. So the House Select Committee on Assassinations and the Clark panel, which preceded them, Ramsey Clark was Attorney General, and in 1967 he assembled a panel to examine the autopsy materials, and in 1968 they wrote their report. The Clark panel decided that the semicircular beveled notch, yes, it's an exit wound, but that it's right here. But that the exit point was here, and the Clark panel and the HSCA panel, which rubber stamped the Clark panel's work, decided that this photograph really depicts this part of the skull, not the left rear. It's one thing for academics to disagree about something, but when they engage in a subterfuge and sleight of hand and withhold what they have done from the American people, it's really dishonest. The House Select Committee published an entire volume, Volume 7, about the medical evidence and their findings. Never once in that volume did they explain that their panel had reoriented this photo and that they disagreed with the description made by the people who were actually at the autopsy. Well, I choose to believe the people who were at the autopsy. Drs. Humes, Dr. Boswell, Dr. Ebersol, and John Stringer, the photographer, said this was the back of the head. Dr. Mantic has confirmed it. Paul O'Connor, one of the Navy enlisted autopsy technicians who assisted the autopsy doctors that night, confirmed prior to his death that this is indeed an image of the back of the head and that the huge cavity is in the top of the head and the right rear of the head. So I choose to believe the people who were present in the Bethesda morgue that this is an image of the back of the head, and I believe the HSCA panel's conclusion that yes, this is evidence of exit. The beveled notch is evidence of exit, but it's an exit wound in the left rear of the skull, up high. Therefore, it's evidence of a shot from the front. If you have an exit wound in the rear of the skull, it's another way of saying that the president was shot from the front. So that's my interpretation of what this photograph really means. If you read the Clark panel report or the HSCA medical volume, they'll tell you this is the right front of the skull. I don't believe it, and the HSCA panel was intellectually dishonest by not telling its audience that they had reoriented the photo 180 degrees. It's important to understand how all this focus on surgery of the head area began, and I want to give proper credit to the person who discovered this in the official records. The two FBI agents at President Kennedy's autopsy, Seibert and O'Neill, wrote a report of what they saw and witnessed a few days later. As it turns out, they wrote and submitted their report the same day that Roger Boyjan of the Marine Corps wrote and submitted his report. They wrote their report on November 26th, 1963, the day after the funeral. And it's become known in the research community as the Seibert-O'Neill report. It's actually what the FBI calls an FD-302 report. That's the name of the form that it's on. The Seibert-O'Neill report contains verbatim quotes of various things they heard the chief pathologist, Dr. Hume, say during the autopsy. And perhaps the most important quote in the report is where they're quoting Dr. Hume saying the following. Now, they didn't use quote marks in their report. I'm going to use quote marks in this recapitulation for the sake of clarity. They report Dr. Hume saying, quote, "There has been surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull," unquote. I want to repeat that. There's been surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. That's what they heard Dr. Hume say. That's what they wrote down in their notes. That's what they put in their report. The problem with this is that there was no surgery of the cranium in Dallas whatsoever. So Dr. Hume's was reporting a major finding to anybody interested in forensics and how did this president get killed? Surgery of the head area. Researcher David Lifton discovered this in 1966, I believe, when that Seibert-O'Neill report was finally released by the National Archives. That report of what the agents witnessed at the autopsy was buried by the Warren Commission. Arlen Specter made sure it did not get published in the 26 volumes. He sent it straight to the archives. It was released by the archives about 1966. Edward J. Epstein published it in his book, and then Josiah Thompson later published it in his book a year later. So David Lifton became aware in 1966 of this statement, and to him it was an alarming statement because it indicated possible tampering with the president's wounds. David Lifton published a major forensic thriller, a major book on the assassination in 1981 called Best Evidence. Many of you will be familiar with that. He focused on the surgery statement in the Seibert-O'Neill report and the importance of it. It was his conclusion that the surgery to the president's wounds that altered the appearance of the wounds and allowed people to remove evidence, it was his conclusion that this surgery took place before the body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital. It's my conclusion, after the 10 sworn depositions we took of autopsy witnesses and of our numerous unsworn interviews that we conducted, that this surgery took place at Bethesda Naval Hospital after the body arrived. As I've already stated, we know that the president's body arrived at 6:35 p.m. per Sergeant Boyjan of the Marine Corps, per his report. We know that the official autopsy didn't start until 8 o'clock. So the real question is, what happened to the president's body during that 85 minutes, almost an hour and a half, between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. when the autopsy started? What happened during that hour and a half? That's the story of this medical cover-up. I'm convinced that that's when this surgery took place, before a minimal audience, very small in size. After 8 o'clock, many witnesses were allowed into the morgue and observed the official autopsy. They saw an enormous head wound. Beyond their belief, really, it was so large. They never saw Dr. Humes perform a craniotomy or any surgery. They did see him easily remove the brain. And it's clear to me that it's after 8 o'clock that the FBI agents heard Dr. Humes make this comment. So when David Lifton wrote his book, it was his conclusion that Dr. Humes had made an excited oral utterance revealing the fact that he had discovered tampering done by someone else on the body of the president. There's been surgery of the head area. But this can't be true. It cannot be true. The FBI agents were not admitted into the morgue until 8 o'clock, along with the rest of the morgue audience who witnessed the autopsy from 8 to 11 p.m. Dr. Humes made this statement in front of his large morgue audience and in front of the FBI agents. There's been surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. I believe that this was a panic reaction by Dr. Humes to the disbelief expressed by his audience. After all, his audience was composed of his peers, his medical colleagues from the hospital. These people did not want to believe that this enormous wound in the president's head, where all the bone was missing here and the bone is flapped out on the right side and missing in the rear, they didn't want to believe that was done by one bullet. They found it hard to believe. The enlisted men who were present at the autopsy have stated that there were gasps and exclamations of disbelief. The enlisted men working at the autopsy have told researchers since then that the audience was in a disbelieving frame of mind, was shocked, horrified, and were very skeptical that all this damage could have been caused by one bullet. I think Dr. Humes was reacting to this pressure from his audience, and in stating, oh, there's been surgery of the head area and the top of the skull, I think it was a way for him to distance himself from what he had performed 1 hour earlier. Okay? I think Dr. Humes performed the surgery. Ed Reed saw him doing it. Tom Robinson saw him doing it. He knew that what he had done was obstruction of justice. He was probably extremely nervous about it. So when his audience expressed shock and disbelief, I believe Dr. Humes engaged in what a psychologist calls dissociation. I have a psychologist friend in Pennsylvania, Stephen Kosser. He has told me this is classic dissociation. I see a problem here, Dr. Humes says, but I didn't do it. I'm reporting it to you, so I couldn't have done it. So I think that's what's going on with the surgery statement, and here is the document. Here before you is the key page from the Seibert O'Neill report, which shows the exact language reported by the two FBI agents in their report. Surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. Now, there are 3 additional proofs of illicit clandestine surgery at Bethesda, and I'd like to show you what they are. First, Alan Belmont was the number 3 man in the FBI. Alan Belmont worked directly under Clyde Tolson, and Clyde Tolson worked directly under H. Edgar Hoover. Alan Belmont was later placed in charge of the assassination investigation for the FBI. There's a memo dated the night of the autopsy, 11/22/63, with some marginalia on it, which indicates that it may have been written shortly after 9 o'clock, between 9 and 9:30. This memo mentions a bullet found on a stretcher in Dallas, and it also mentions a bullet, quote, lodged behind the ear, end quote, and the FBI's plans to obtain that bullet lodged behind the ear. The important thing here is that no such bullet was mentioned in either the FBI agent's report from November 26th or in the autopsy report written by the Navy. Once again, I emphasize, there's no intact bullet removed from the skull and mentioned in either the FBI agent's report, the Seibert O'Neill report, or in the Navy autopsy protocol. And yet this high-level official knew about a bullet lodged behind the ear on Friday night while the autopsy was still in progress. So it's my conclusion that this high-level official, Alan Belmont, was in telephonic contact that night during the autopsy with someone on the scene who knew what was going on and was reporting it to him by telephone. Somebody, Admiral Galloway, the head of the entire complex, Captain Stover, the head of the medical school, someone other than Seibert and O'Neill. They had not been admitted into the morgue yet. Someone present during that early clandestine surgery was reporting things to Alan Belmont on the telephone, or he would not have put this in writing in a memo addressed to Clyde Tolson. He knew there had been a bullet lodged behind the ear and that it was being recovered. That's a very important statement in law enforcement and forensic terms. Here's another indicator that there was postmortem surgery before the autopsy started, and it's the fact that mortician Tom Robinson witnessed many small metal fragments removed from the cranium and placed in a small vial or test tube. He estimated there were about 10 of these fragments during his review board interview in 1996. Now, the significance of this is that, according to the official record, there were only 2 tiny fragments of metal removed from President Kennedy's skull, according to the record. Those 2 fragments were taken by FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill to the FBI laboratory after the autopsy was over. Their remains, they've been forensically tested, but their remains still exist today. The 2 tiny fragments are in the National Archives, and you can see them by special appointment. But those are the only 2 fragments recorded as removed from his body in the autopsy report written by the Navy. And those are the only 2 fragments that physically exist today removed from his body. And yet we know from Tom Robinson here that there was a whole vial or test tube full of 10 or more small fragments. There's a third indicator of postmortem surgery before the autopsy started, and this is the recollections of HM1 Dennis David, who typed a receipt for 4 large bullet fragments and examined them closely himself. Now, Dennis David was as an HM1, a first-class corpsman, an E6. He was filling the role that day of chief of the day at Bethesda. He was the person who was shown the 4 fragments by a federal agent and who was required to type a receipt for the 4 fragments, documenting their transfer from the Navy at Bethesda to a federal activity. He remembers typing the receipt. He remembers the agent taking the receipt with him and the typewriter ribbon from the typewriter. He also remembers being shown the fragments and being allowed to hold them in his hand, which is not good forensic procedure, but he says that's what happened. The agent let me hold the fragments, and he said there were 4 fragments, more mass than 1 bullet, less mass than 2 complete bullets. So those items of evidence, those 4 fragments and that receipt, are not in the evidence trail today. No one knows where they are or what happened to them. So to wrap this up, these 3 additional indicators, other than the red incision, which removed the entrance wound here, these 3 additional indicators are proofs that there was clandestine surgery taking place at Bethesda before the autopsy began at 8 o'clock, because the records from the official autopsy, the FBI report and the autopsy protocol, only talk about 2 tiny fragments, which are minuscule in size. It's almost impossible to see them. You need a magnifying glass. So I've concluded, as I said, that there was clandestine illicit surgery to the president's cranium before the autopsy began to remove evidence of shots from the front, before the autopsy began. Was there time to perform this activity before the autopsy began? Well, my conclusions are yes, and here are the reasons why I'm convinced there was more than enough time to perform this obstruction of justice. We know from the Boysen report that a casket arrived at 6:35 p.m. You'll recall that earlier I mentioned the report written by Marine Sergeant Roger Boysen, summarizing the activities of his physical security detail at the Bethesda morgue the night of the autopsy, in which he stated that the casket arrived at 1835 hours. That's 6:35 p.m. civilian time. A key question as we study the JFK assassination medical evidence is, was there time available to perform the clandestine surgery on President Kennedy's wounds between the time the body arrived at 6:35 p.m. and the time the autopsy began in front of an audience at 8 o'clock p.m.? My conclusions are the answer is yes. We're about to discuss a sequence of key events that occurred between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. that night, involving 3 separate casket entries. To understand what went down at Bethesda Naval Hospital the night of the assassination, one must study the sequence of events, the timeline of events between 6:35 p.m. when the president's body arrived at the Bethesda morgue loading dock, and 8:00 p.m. when the public autopsy record began. What happened during those 85 minutes is the key to understanding how the cover-up was implemented, how brazen it was, and how much it was a cover-up on the fly, really an act of desperation by people who had lost control of events. The first event in the timeline of events is the arrival of the cheap shipping casket at the morgue loading dock in a black hearse at 6:35 p.m. This was offloaded by Navy sailors by a working party headed by Petty Officer Dennis David. Marine Corps Sergeant Boyjan recorded the exact time in his report. Now, I'd like to say a few words about Dennis David and explain what he brings to this story. Dennis David was a Navy corpsman, an HM1 or an E6. He was filling the role that day of Chief of the Day at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. Even though he wasn't a chief, he was an E6, and he had a lot of responsibility. He was called by the Secret Service early that evening and said, "Get a working party together. Your visitor is about to arrive." And he understood what that meant because the Secret Service had taken over the hospital with about 40 agents, and he knew what was coming. President Kennedy's body was coming. So he gathered up all the sailors he could, some from the medical school, some from the dental school, and assembled a working party on the morgue loading dock. He and his working party observed a black hearse drive up in the darkness. A hearse is a black Cadillac specifically designed by the funeral trade to carry caskets. And behind the hearse was a follow-up car. Men in suits with short haircuts got out of the follow-up car and out of the hearse. The two people in front of the hearse were wearing white operating room smocks, which is significant. I believe it means they were employees of the Gawler Funeral Home, and I believe the hearse belonged to the Gawler's Funeral Home. That's the mortuary activity that embalmed the president's remains. Dennis David and his working party moved the shipping casket to the morgue anteroom. That's the chill box room, waiting area outside the morgue proper. And they set down the shipping casket, and then they were told to leave. Dennis David then walked forward to the front of the hospital and sat in an office on the second floor, which was near the rotunda. At the front of Bethesda, there's a rotunda near the main entrance and a tower above the rotunda. About 20 minutes after he offloaded the shipping casket at the morgue loading dock, he observed the motorcade arrive from Andrews Air Force Base. This is a motorcade of many vehicles with police escort, police motorcycle escort, which arrived out in front of the hospital. There was a large crowd waiting, interested citizens and bystanders grieving for the fallen president, just wanting to observe what was going to happen. He observed Jackie Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy get out of the light gray Navy ambulance. He observed a Secret Service agent get out of the ambulance and another man in a suit who happened to be Admiral Berkeley in civilian clothes. Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and others got out of other vehicles. Jackie Kennedy, Robert McNamara, Robert Kennedy, and the Kennedy entourage immediately entered the building, came into the rotunda, and went up the elevators to the VIP suite. Now, the time of arrival of this light gray Navy ambulance was 6:55 p.m. It was recorded by the newspaper people and by the Secret Service agents who wrote reports. This just happens to be 20 minutes after the time of arrival of the casket recorded by Sergeant Boyjan in his Marine Corps after-action report. He recorded a casket arriving. The casket arrived at 18:35. That's 6:35 p.m. The arrival of this motorcade at 6:55 p.m. is 20 minutes later. Both of those times are confidently documented by contemporaneous documents. The 20-minute lag between the arrival of the president's body and the motorcade is exactly what Dennis David recalled for years to any and everyone who interviewed him, is about 20 minutes between the time he moved the shipping casket to the morgue anteroom to the time the motorcade arrived. So this corroborates and verifies Dennis David's story and verifies him as a reliable witness, because he was spot on in his recollection of the time lag. He first began telling his story about his involvement in events in 1975 to a newspaper man. Researcher David Lifton interviewed him extensively in 1979 and 1980, including on film, and the story remained consistent. Dennis David has been interviewed many times since 1975, including by me during the time of the review board, and his story has remained very, very consistent, without embellishment, without changes, and in my view, he's an extremely reliable witness. This is important because Dennis David told me when I interviewed him in 1997, I believe it was, that after the autopsy was over, he asked Dr. Boswell, one of the two Navy pathologists, was that President Kennedy's body in the shipping casket that I offloaded from the Black Hearse? And Dr. Boswell affirmed that and said, yes, you ought to know, you carried it into the morgue yourself. So Dennis David received confirmation from one of the two Navy autopsy pathologists, Dr. Boswell, that that was President Kennedy's body that arrived in the shipping casket. And we know the time of the shipping casket's arrival from the Boysen report, 6:35 p.m. As I've said, the light gray Navy ambulance arrived at 6:55 p.m. Let me explain what I mean when I talk about the Dallas casket. Air Force One flew from Love Field in Texas to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland with the Kennedy entourage on board and with a large ornamental bronze ceremonial viewing coffin. President Kennedy's body had been placed into this viewing casket at Parkland Hospital. Ambulance driver Aubrey Reich, who worked for the O'Neill Funeral Home, had witnessed the body placed in the casket. In fact, he assisted with placing President Kennedy's body, which was wrapped in sheets. The body was wrapped in a sheet, and another sheet was wrapped around the head. He assisted in moving the body at Parkland into the bronze ceremonial coffin. He then witnessed his boss, Mr. O'Neill, close the lid, and because Aubrey Reich was the ambulance driver for the funeral home, for O'Neill Funeral Home, he drove the coffin personally to Love Field and witnessed it taken on board Air Force One. So there was no interruption of that chain of custody at that time. He saw the body placed in the bronze casket. He was with the casket. No one opened it at any time, and he saw it taken on board Air Force One. At 6 o'clock p.m., Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base, and shortly thereafter, the public all over America viewed on their television screens the lowering of this bronze casket in a mechanized forklift, the lowering of the casket to the ground level where it was placed on board a light gray Navy ambulance by many people. Some of the people were members of the Honor Guard, the Joint Service casket team. Some of the people were Kennedy aides assisting with moving the casket into the light gray ambulance. That light gray ambulance did not stop en route to Bethesda Naval Hospital. We know that from our depositions of the two FBI agents who were in that motorcade. It did not stop for any reason. It took about 45 minutes to get there. It arrived at 6:55. But we know from the events with the shipping casket at 6:35 p.m. that bronze Dallas casket could not have contained President Kennedy's body, by definition. So the American people witnessed a charade on television shortly after 6 p.m. on November 22nd. They thought they were watching the president's body put on board a light gray ambulance and driven to Bethesda from Andrews. But what they were really watching was a casket which, unbeknownst to almost everyone around it, was empty. The bronze Dallas casket arrived in the light gray Navy ambulance at 6:55 p.m. After the light gray Navy ambulance arrived, the newspaper reporters out front who wrote stories the next day documented that it sat out front without moving for 12 minutes. The Kennedy entourage and others went inside the hospital immediately. The driver of the light gray Navy ambulance, William Greer, who had driven the limousine in Dealey Plaza, Secret Service Agent Greer just sat there with the car, not moving for 12 minutes. At that point, the two FBI agents who had been in the motorcade and whose job was to attend the autopsy, retrieve bullets from the body, and take them to the FBI lab. That was their job. They walked up to Greer and said, "Why are you sitting here?" I mean, they knew the Dallas casket was in the light gray ambulance. And he says, "I don't know where the morgue is." And they said, "Okay, we're going to get in our car. You follow us. We get our physicals here every year. You follow us. We'll take you back to the morgue." So William Greer, in the light gray ambulance with the Dallas casket inside and no one else in the car, followed the FBI agents around to the back of the Bethesda Naval Hospital, arrived at the morgue. At about 7:17, we know this from another document, at about 7:17, 4 federal agents, and only 4 federal agents, removed this Dallas casket, which had to be empty by definition, removed it from the light gray ambulance and took it to the morgue anteroom. They were not allowed to take it into the morgue. They took it into the anteroom outside the morgue. The 4 agents who moved the casket at about 7:17 p.m. were FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill and Secret Service agents Kellerman and Greer. We know this because the 2 FBI agents were interviewed by the House Committee. The HSCA interviewed them in 1977 and 78. They told about this event in great detail, the casket entry that they personally were involved in. As far as they knew, it was the only casket entry from their viewpoint. And it was only the 4 federal agents moving this casket. And it was so heavy they had to use a wheeled conveyance, similar to a dolly, to move it. I'm sure what they had was a church truck. In the funeral trade, a gurney with wheels, where the gurney can be raised and lowered, is called a church truck. I'm sure that's what was used to move this heavy casket from the light gray ambulance to the morgue anteroom. Now, we know the FBI agents were not admitted immediately for 2 reasons. There's 2 items of evidence supporting that. In their official report, and you can here see the document, here you can see the page of their own report in which they state, "A tight security was immediately placed around the morgue by the Navy and the Secret Service. The Bureau agents, namely themselves, advised the Secret Service of the Bureau's interest in this matter." Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that that's bureaucratic language for they wouldn't let us in, and we were upset about it. These guys were denied immediate entry into the morgue, and the casket was sitting there in the anteroom, and the agents were with it, and they didn't understand why. In his deposition with the review board, Agent Seibert confirmed that they set the casket down in the anteroom, not in the morgue proper. In subsequent years, the agents always denied that anyone kept them out of the morgue, and always denied that they failed to maintain a good chain of custody on the body. They always denied that. I think it was nothing but CYA. Everybody lies at some point in their life for some reason. These guys were lying for years to protect their reputations. They weren't about to admit that they lost the chain of custody on the body and that they'd been hoodwinked and that they were kept out of the morgue. So they never admitted to this. But Dr. Humes, the chief pathologist, in a conversation with one of his neighbors who worked for CBS network, television network, told his neighbor that the FBI agents were never in the morgue and that they were kept in an anteroom during the autopsy. So that's the other lie that was told. Both lies were half true, okay? It's true that the 2 FBI agents took the bronze casket from Dallas to the vicinity of the morgue themselves with the assistance of 2 Secret Service agents. That part is true. But they really set it down in the anteroom. It's not true that they were kept out of the morgue during the entire autopsy. But Dr. Humes said they were, and here's the document that shows that. This is the crucial page from the CBS memo written recounting the conversation that Humes had with his neighbor, in which he says the FBI agents were never lied. They were never in the morgue during the autopsy. They were kept in an anteroom. So that's the other half of the story. The part of that story that's true is that, yes, they were kept in the anteroom for a while. We know they were admitted later because they took notes and they wrote a report of everything they witnessed and everything they heard. So to summarize here, the second casket entry that night was the empty Dallas casket taken to the morgue anteroom by 4 federal agents at 7:17 p.m. and then set on the floor. There's another casket entry that night, and this is the second entry for the Dallas casket, and it's at 8 o'clock p.m., and it's undeniable that this entry took place because it was the ceremonial honor guard, the joint service casket team, men from the different armed services in their dress uniforms wearing white gloves, that took the casket into the morgue proper, the bronze Dallas casket, with President Kennedy's body now inside, took it inside at 8 o'clock p.m., set it down. The casket was open in front of witnesses, and everyone saw that it was President Kennedy inside, wrapped in sheets, as he had been when he left Dallas. The 2 FBI agents witnessed the opening of the Dallas casket. They witnessed President Kennedy's body inside, removed, placed on the examining table, wrapped in sheets, and they recognized that it was him. It's clear to me that they were taken to another room and sequestered, told to stand by and wait while the preparations for the autopsy were being made. They told one of their internal officials in an interview in 1964 that the time of preparations for the autopsy was 7:17 p.m. I know what that means. That's the time that they and the 2 Secret Service agents offloaded the empty Dallas casket. They didn't know it was empty, but it was. Set it down in the anteroom, and that's the time the FBI agents were refused admittance into the morgue. And that's why they placed enough importance on this event to give a time to it, to give a time to Mr. Rosen of the FBI when they said the time of preparation was 7:17 p.m. I'm convinced that the time they were allowed to finally enter the morgue was right at 8 o'clock, right after the Joint Service Casket Team, the honor guard, had taken the Dallas casket into the morgue with President Kennedy's body reintroduced into it. Now, what does this mean? This means that a cursory examination was performed of President Kennedy's true wounds right after he arrived at 6:35. Some photographs were taken of the real wounds. We know that from eyewitness testimony. They never made it into the official record. Clandestine illicit surgery was then performed to radically expand the cranial wound and remove evidence of shots from the front. Surgery was performed on the throat wound to expand the throat wound and remove evidence of a shot from the front and the throat. The 2 X-ray technicians were then recalled to the morgue. Remember, they had been dismissed, summarily dismissed when the surgery began. They were recalled to the morgue after being upstairs about 15 minutes. They took the skull X-rays. After that, a quick series of autopsy photographs was taken. Most of the autopsy photographs, as you'll notice in this presentation, show President Kennedy lying supine with his head in a metal head brace or a stirrup. I'm convinced that that entire series of photographs was taken immediately after the skull X-rays and before the autopsy started. Because no one at the autopsy proper, no one at the official autopsy from 8 to 11 p.m. recalls any metal head brace being used. It was normally not used at Bethesda. It was not used that night between 8 and 11. No one in the large audience saw it being used. And yet, 2/3 of the autopsy photographs show President Kennedy's head in this head brace. So I'm convinced that this initial series of shots was taken right after the surgery, right after the X-rays. And the people that did this were very psychologically astute. They even put a fresh towel underneath President Kennedy's head. So you can see in these photographs there's a fresh towel with a blue-green stripe on it and the medical caduceus symbol identifying the location as Bethesda. And this is to give the viewer the impression that the body just arrived because there's a fresh towel laying under his head, underneath the head brace. And of course, no one's made any incisions on the body or the towel wouldn't be fresh, would it? This was a very clever psychological trick. Once this quick series of photographs was taken, all showing the back of the head obscured, totally obscured by the head brace. The body laying flat on the table, the back of the head can't be seen, it's in the head brace. All you can see is massive amounts of damage to the top of the head and the right side. Once those photos are taken, it's at that time that President Kennedy's body had to have been reintroduced into the empty Dallas casket reunited with the light gray ambulance and allowed to be found by the Joint Service Casket Team. Now, this is actually what happened that night. If you buy David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, he explains in better detail than anyone else ever has the shell game that was going on with the casket that night. The Joint Service Casket Team flew to Bethesda from Andrews Air Force Base in an Army helicopter. Their job is to stay with the body and provide due ceremony during the autopsy, a ceremonial guard. They lost the custody of the casket. At some point that night, a decoy ambulance was driven away into the darkness at high speed. The casket team got into a pickup truck, a dirty pickup truck, in their dress uniforms. You can just imagine what that was like, and chased after this thing in the darkness. And reportedly, the ambulance even turned off its lights. They were chasing an ambulance in the darkness and lost the ambulance. And so for 30 minutes or more, the Joint Service Casket Team had lost track of the Commander-in-Chief's casket, couldn't find it, couldn't take it into the morgue. They went back to the front of the hospital, more than a little bit chagrined and worried about the way they were going to get chewed out. At some point, they became aware that there was a bronze casket sitting in a light gray Navy ambulance out in front of the hospital shortly before 8 o'clock. And they followed it around. It was driven around. They followed it around to the back. And that's when the 8 o'clock casket entry took place. The Joint Service Casket Team had to be allowed to take the President's casket, the one he was placed in Dallas, into the morgue. There had to be a public record of that. So there was. There was also a record of one person who found all this very disturbing. Mortician Tom Robinson, when he was interviewed by the HSCA in 1977, if you'll check the transcript of his interview, there's one point at which he says, the body was taken, and then the body never came. And that statement of his is filled with ellipses, which indicates that part of his statement has been removed. I mean, that's generally the meaning of ellipses in written text. But he does say the body was taken and then the body never came. So I think Tom Robinson was the witness to the body being taken away out of the morgue. It's reintroduced into a casket, into a Dallas casket. And then later it was returned, but much later. So summing up, we have a shell game that night. We have a cover-up on the fly, which only succeeded because it was compartmentalized. There were 3 different casket entries, and there were 3 different audiences to the 3 casket entries, and that's the only way these people got away with it. So the first audience to the first casket entry, to the shipping casket from the Black Hearse, is Dennis David and his sailors, but then they're dismissed. And that's the only casket entry they see. The second casket entry is the empty bronze Dallas casket. The audience is the 2 FBI agents and the 2 Secret Service agents. That's the only casket entry the 2 FBI agents ever see. The third casket entry is the second entry for the Dallas casket. JFK's body has been reintroduced into the casket. The witnesses for that are the 2 FBI agents shortly after 8 o'clock and the Joint Service Casket Team, the Honor Guard, and all the other people that were being allowed into the morgue at that time to witness the autopsy record. There were at least 35 witnesses to the autopsy sitting in the gallery. It was a teaching hospital, and there was a row of bleachers, a 3-tiered row of bleachers in the morgue. So as strange and unsettling and disturbing as this story is, it's all true. It's all clearly documented in the record. The Joint Service Casket Team wrote an after-action report, and they recorded the time of their casket entry as 2000. That's 8 o'clock p.m., civilian time. Sergeant Boyjan recorded the time of his casket entry, which was the President's body, at 6:35. And the 2 FBI agents recorded the details of their casket entry, the second one, the empty Dallas casket, to the House committee in the late 1970s, and they reiterated those details to the review board in their sworn depositions in 1997. So these things really took place. And the point I want to make here is that the chain of custody is just as important with bodies as it is with bullets. If you have a bullet that has a broken chain of custody, and several people were to tell a judge at a trial that I don't recognize this as the bullet that I saw the day before, I don't see my initials on this. I don't recognize this bullet. The bullet would not be admitted into evidence. It would be thrown out of trial. It would not be admitted into evidence. This is the story of the magic bullet, by the way, Commission Exhibit 399. It has a broken chain of custody. And many people interviewed by the FBI in the summer of '64 said they could not positively identify it as the bullet they saw the day of the assassination. So that bullet has a broken chain of custody. The body has a broken chain of custody. What does this mean? It means that all the conclusions that derive from the autopsy itself, like the autopsy report and even the autopsy photographs and x-rays, are now suspect. Because the question becomes, what happened to that body between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock? And if one doesn't precisely know, then how can one admit the autopsy report into evidence? So this broken chain of custody of the body indicates tampering with a crime scene. This is very important. This broken chain of custody with the body indicates tampering with a crime scene. It's extremely important to understand that. The illicit surgery on President Kennedy's wounds, which took place between 6:35 and 8 o'clock before the autopsy started, was in effect someone's attempt to sanitize the crime scene, to remove evidence from a crime scene. His body is the crime scene. Expanding wounds on his head by a factor of 5, the original exit wound was expanded from 35 square centimeters to 170 square centimeters. That's 5 times bigger. In order to remove evidence, that changes the geometry of the shooting. It brings into doubt where an entrance wound was, where a real exit wound was, and it would invalidate any conclusions reached by the ensuing autopsy. So the crime scene was sanitized. At the very least, it's obstruction of justice. And that's why this shell game, the story of the 3 casket entries, is so important. It indicates that something is very, very wrong the evening of November 22nd, 1963. If a lone assassin killed the president and it was a simple murder and there was no controversy about what happened, none of this would have been necessary. Now, in the last item, you'll see that the first autopsy incision was at 8:15 p.m. That's correct. That was recorded by the 2 FBI agents in their report. But we know from the Joint Service Casket Team that the casket was actually taken in the final time at 8 o'clock. And I'd like to add one more clarifying comment. When President Kennedy's body first arrived in the shipping casket at 6:35 p.m., it was not only in a cheap aluminum shipping casket, but the body inside was in a zippered body bag. And that's significant because President Kennedy's body was not placed in a body bag at Parkland Hospital. The body was wrapped in a sheet, his nude body was wrapped in a sheet, and his head was wrapped in a sheet at Parkland. So the fact that this body arrives in the wrong casket and in the wrong wrappings at 6:35 indicates a definite break in the chain of custody, and therefore all the conclusions that flow from the autopsy are suspect at the very least. When his body was reintroduced into the Dallas casket before it was allowed to be found again at 8 o'clock, it was once again wrapped as it had been in Dallas. Somebody was the battalion commander on the ground for this cover-up and knew what to do to at least fool the audience. I might add that it was common knowledge at Bethesda that night amongst the Navy enlisted personnel, it was common knowledge that there was a decoy ambulance. Everyone was talking about it. The Secret Service admitted it to some of the enlisted men. And in fact, Lieutenant Lipsey, Army Lieutenant Lipsey, who was the aide to General Wheel was the commandant of the Military District of Washington. He was an Army general in charge of all Washington ceremonies. His aide, Lieutenant Lipsey, even informed the House Select Committee on Assassinations when they interviewed him in the 1970s that he knew there was a decoy ambulance and told them that it was common knowledge, and it was done to fool reporters. So he acknowledged a decoy ambulance. It was common knowledge among the enlisted men, and that's what the Joint Service Casket Team tore off after in a pickup truck chasing in the dark was the decoy ambulance. And while they were gone, President Kennedy's body was reintroduced into the Dallas casket, driven back out in front of the hospital in another light gray ambulance. So That's why there was a decoy ambulance. It was to get the honor guard out of the way. So here are my conclusions about the morgue timeline that night. I conclude that the illicit surgery was performed on President Kennedy's body between approximately 6:45 p.m. and probably about 7:05 p.m., removing all forensic evidence of frontal shots. Following cranial surgery to remove evidence of shots from the front, misleading x-rays and photos were taken between about 7:05 and 7:30, and the damage to the cranium caused by surgery was misrepresented for over 3 decades as the exit wound caused by a shot from behind. The large exit wound seen in Dallas in the right rear of the head was carefully obscured by a metal head brace during this initial photo session. And finally, JFK's body was placed inside the bronze Dallas casket shortly before 8 p.m. and was found by the casket team, which promptly brought the body in at 8 o'clock p.m. So the important conclusion to derive from this is that everything that took place, almost everything that took place between 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock p.m. before the large morgue audience was a charade performed by actors in front of an audience. The actors were Drs. Humes and Boswell, the 2 Navy pathologists. The audience included all of the people sitting in the gallery and even poor Dr. Fink, who arrived at 8:30 and clearly was not privy to what had gone on before 8 o'clock. Now here's an image of the metal head brace I've discussed, used in the photo setup immediately after the clandestine postmortem surgery. This is the simple device that was used to obscure the condition of the rear of the head. You can't see the condition of the rear of the head. How convenient. And this is true in many, many autopsy views. You can see in this image the medical caduceus, the medical symbol that was on all the Bethesda Naval Hospital towels. You can see that in the image. You can see the fresh towel placed under the head brace to give the impression to the viewer that this body's just arrived, when in fact that wasn't the case. The question now becomes, if JFK's body was not in the Dallas casket when it was offloaded from the airplane in front of the television cameras after 6 o'clock p.m. on 11/22/63, when was it removed and why? It's clear to me and to David Lufton and others who have studied this problem that the body was removed very soon after it was taken on board the airplane, almost immediately, and certainly was removed before the swearing in of President Johnson. So the body was removed almost immediately, and I think it was done out of simple fear that the Dallas authorities might show up and demand to do a Texas autopsy. After all, the Secret Service had had a confrontation with Dr. Earl Rose, the county coroner at Parkland Hospital, as the body left the building. Dr. Rose had insisted that an autopsy be performed immediately under Texas law. He was the county coroner, it was his job, and the Secret Service had adamantly refused to allow him to perform his duty. At the time, the assassination of a president wasn't even a federal crime, and this crime was subject to Texas state law at the time. And so Dr. Rose was entirely within his rights to demand that an autopsy be performed. If he had been allowed to do so, all of American history would likely be different today. I mean, significant events that have happened in the last 50 years would be completely different. The cover-up of the JFK assassination would not have been possible. But the Secret Service denied Dr. Rose the permission to do an autopsy. Profanity was exchanged. They pushed him out of the way. He insisted, and they told him, if you don't get out of the way, we're going to run you over with the casket. That's the recollection of Dr. Paul Peters, who was interviewed in 1988 for a documentary. So after showing their weapons, they were allowed to leave the hospital. But I'm sure the overriding fear in the minds of the Secret Service was that the Texas authorities might show up before the airplane could take off and take the body from them and perform an honest autopsy. And I'm sure that these people were under strict instructions not to allow a Texas autopsy. There's no doubt in my mind. So I think that's why the body was immediately removed from the casket, right after the casket was taken on board the airplane, certainly before the swearing in, because we know that after the swearing in, the Kennedy entourage gathered around the casket and conducted an Irish wake. As the plane flew back to Washington, they all sat around and drank alcohol and told stories about the dead president to each other and stayed by the casket. So this had to happen. This had to happen right away. So this removal of the body from the casket had to have happened immediately, right after it was loaded onto the airplane. The question then becomes, how did President Kennedy's body arrive at Bethesda Naval Hospital before the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade? I've told you already that the body arrived 20 minutes before the bronze casket. And the question becomes, how did it get there, and was there enough time? The answer is there was enough time, and now I'll explain to you exactly what happened. Let's run very quickly through this series of events. Air Force One landed at 6 o'clock. It was on the blocks at 6:04. The bronze casket from Dallas was driven away in the light gray Navy cardiac ambulance at 6:09 p.m. LBJ's Hilo, Army 1, took off at 6:19 p.m. As soon as that happened, the television lights were turned off, extinguished almost immediately, and the television feed from Andrews Air Force Base terminated. I've watched the recordings on DVD, and that's the source for these times and for these observations. We know that Johnson's Hilo landed at 6:26 p.m. at the south lawn of the White House. Therefore, we know the length of that trip. The length of that trip was 7 minutes. And we also know that Washington, D.C. is a very small city, and that Bethesda is very close to northwest Washington, D.C., very close. And the White House is in northwest Washington. Bethesda is very close by. So we know that JFK's body would only have taken a little bit longer than the time it took Johnson's Hilo to get to the White House to get to Bethesda. Was there enough time available? And the answer is yes. The lights went out at Andrews at 6:19 p.m. If JFK's body, wrapped in sheets now and not in a casket, if JFK's body had taken off in a helicopter for Bethesda sometime between 6:20 and 6:22, it would have had an 8 to 10 minute time period to arrive at Bethesda. And I judge that that's adequate to get there. It took 7 minutes to get to the White House. I'm sure Johnson's helicopter was not speeding. I'm sure that pilot that night, after what had happened in this country, was taking his time and flying very carefully to the White House. So to get to Bethesda would only have taken 1 or 2 minutes longer. And as it turns out, if that trip took 8 to 10 minutes, then the body could have arrived at the Bethesda Oak Club parking lot by 6:30, and which would have given the shipping casket and the hearse plenty of time to arrive at the morgue loading dock by 6:35. Now let me amplify on some of this. We know from Paul O'Connor, one of the Navy enlisted autopsy technicians who was at the autopsy, we know from Paul O'Connor and his interviews with William Law in the year 2003 that a helicopter did land in the Oak Club parking lot. He heard this. He said that noise was very loud. It was distinct and different from the helicopters that landed in front of Bethesda at the normal landing pad. So the helicopters that landed in front, he knew that they were landing on the normal helo pad, and that would have been the Army helicopters carrying the honor guard from Andrews. Paul O'Connor knew that the Oak Club parking lot, the Officers Club parking lot, was very close to the morgue. He heard a helicopter land in what could only have been the Oak Club parking lot. So, and his story was consistently that a very short time later, after he heard that helicopter land close by in the parking lot, the morgue doors burst open and the shipping casket was brought in. So, Paul O'Connor is not only a witness to a helicopter landing at the Officers Club parking lot, but he's the witness to the arrival of a shipping casket and of the fact that the body was inside a zippered body bag. He's a very important witness.